I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house in the past. Given how frequently my mother was in and out of jail and rehab, she might as well have raised me even though she didn't. But that's not to say I had a horrible upbringing. I got to spend a lot of time with my cousins when they came to visit, even though it might not have been as wonderful as some had. Grandma was an excellent chef, and the house was in a lovely location on the edge of the woods. No one can take away my enjoyment of my youth. Actually, over the years I lived at my grandmother's place, I only had one genuinely unpleasant encounter. It was a better start to the day than most. I wasn't in school because it was early summer and the days weren't yet too hot. Thomas and Isabel, my two cousins, had stayed with me at Grandma's the night before. We had stayed up viewing a number of old movies the previous evening, so we woke up exhausted on the family room couch. We went to the pool after a filling meal of pancakes and sausage, and then we returned home to play by the woods. Grandma began calling for us from the back deck at that point. She reprimanded us for failing to clean up after ourselves and for scattering VHS cassettes around the family room floor. We begged, "Can't we clean up after our game? I'm heading to your grandfather's workplace to hand off a few things. After that, I'm heading to the shop to get items for dinner. If that room isn't clean when I return..." "Grandma, we understand," we returned the call. After giving us a tongue click, she grinned and proceeded to the car. I don't recall every game we played, but I do recall that Isabel, my younger cousin, stopped wanting to play since we were spending too much time in the woods. They weren't frightening at all. I've always found the coniferous forest to be magical. Acorns and pine cones were abundant in the woods for me to gather in the fall. Herds of juvenile white-tailed deer frequented it in the spring. Additionally, my grandmother's backyard looked like the cover of a Christmas CD throughout the winter months due to the snow cover. As much as Thomas and I enjoyed the woods, Isabel, for some reason, avoided them today. We would have gone in regardless of her reluctance, because the hills soon started to roll in ominous gray clouds. As we shuffled through the stacks of VHS tapes we had left on the floor, the water droplets started to cover the windows. Like little children, we had taken a number of them out and left them strewn around in search of ones we could all agree on, even though we hadn't watched the majority of them the previous evening. Thomas and I had to match the majority of the tapes to their appropriate situations, because Isabel was only 5 years old and not yet able to read. The majority of the VHS tapes were black, in case you weren't raised around them. That was the norm. Rarer were the fully colored ones we had, and occasionally there would be those with a different color on the top strip. I offer this to illustrate why what transpired next was so peculiar, as well as to evoke a little nostalgia for a time when technology was simpler. You see, we knew exactly which colored VHS cassettes we had since they were so uncommon, a blue one and 2 orange ones. The blue one, which was among the orange ones along with Rugrats, was ironically not Blue's Clues. Monsters, Inc. was the blue one. However, Isabel handed me a tape and asked me which one it went to that afternoon, as the storm really began to lie in thick, and the view out the windows was nearly entirely obscured. In addition to the fact that I had never seen the dark red VHS tape before, I was also perplexed by the unreadable writing on the front. "Hey Thomas, look at this. Is it readable?" Thomas appeared just as perplexed as I did. It's true that neither of us had previously seen the VHS, and we wouldn't have forgotten such a striking color. Thomas reassured me that the writing on the cassette couldn't have been in English, and that I wasn't insane. To find out, we agreed to see it. We assumed Isabel had simply taken another VHS tape from the shelf while we were not looking, and loved the color, even though she denied it. I switched on the TV after Thomas inserted the tape into the player. We initially believed it to be ineffective. Except for the writing on the screen's margins, which indicated the tape was homemade, the screen was completely black. However, all of the letters were written in that strange script, which I was positive did not even use the same alphabet as English. As we were ready to remove it, I saw that the timestamp was increasing, indicating that it was functioning, and that the person who had taken the video was merely shooting in the dark. It's most likely an old home video that Grandma made and simply left the camera running overnight or something. I'm increased me. But why would it be written that way? To find out, perhaps we should simply go back in time. Rewinding the tape made the most sense, and I concurred with Thomas. I pressed the player's button and moved to the couch next to my cousins to relax. Since the working idea was that Grandma had left the camera on overnight, I had anticipated that the tape would take a long time to rewind. However, just after I got settled, I heard the characteristic click of the tape reaching the beginning. I stood up again to hit play, and Thomas and I exchanged a bewildered glance. The land on the highway's edge was shown in the first scene. It was obvious that the person recording was strolling along the street. When the videographer entered the cab of a long-haul semi-truck in the following scene, my suspicions that they were hitchhiking were validated. The trucker grinned as he peered into the camera. He was an elderly man with a large pot belly and a salt and pepper beard, making something like a documentary. The first thing we heard the cameraman say was something like that. It sounded upbeat, as if he was obviously required to get off his feet and into a car at last. Additionally, he had an accent from a place my fourth-grade brain was unable to identify. The trucker and the cameraman were chatting amicably as the event went on. The videographer pointed out into the highway ahead of them and mounted the camcorder on the truck's dash. We quickly became disinterested at this point, so I chose to fast-forward the recording. I observed as the cold evening sky and the light on the horizon dipped below the tree line on the screen for a while. I halted the rewind when the camcorder started to shift. As the trucker entered a petrol station in the middle of nowhere, the camera swiveled to capture his actions. Or so I believed. Thomas remarked, "Hey, that's the truck stop on the edge of town." I took a closer look and saw that he was correct. When we went on road trips, Grandma would always stop at this truck stop a few miles out of town to grab snacks and fill up. The videographer started going through the trucker's possessions as soon as he entered the establishment. He pocketed random items as he opened shelves and unzipped duffel bags. In order to improve my view of the TV, I quickly sat down again on the couch beside my cousins. We heard a "what's going on" from the screen shortly after. After returning, the truck driver was not pleased with what his visitor was doing. There was an altercation between the driver and the cameraman. The camcorder was dropped almost instantly, so all I could hear was the sound of a fight while the screen displayed the dusty underbelly of the passenger seat. At least that's what I assumed. The fight sound swiftly changed from eerie to scary. One was clearly choking, but neither was shouting or yelling any longer, breathing difficultly and gasping for breath. Holding on to a glimmer of hope, one of the men kicked the passenger seat, causing the screen to tremble. "I'm scared," Isabel muttered as she took hold of my hand. "It's okay," I told her, although I wasn't entirely sure. "It's simply a frightening film. It isn't real." Isabel put her cheek against my side, and I was glad of the touch. I took Thomas's hand and gave it a squeeze. A glance between us told us what we both knew. Why was that the truck stop we knew so well if this was a horror film? The sounds on the screen ceased. Isabel started to raise her head to take another look, but I restrained her. After retrieving the camcorder from beneath the seat, the cameraman aimed it directly at the deceased truck driver. I yelled, and so did Thomas. He lay clumsily on the cabin's mattress. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face was crimson. The camera then swiveled. We also saw the identity, or lack thereof, of the man who made the movie for the first time. He covered his face with a wooden mask. It was designed to resemble an elderly man, with sad, wrinkled eyes and a large, bulbous nose. All of it was wrapped in gray yarn to create the appearance of long, unkempt hair and a beard to go with it. The action paused. There were only trees now. Isabel questioned us about it, but we remained silent. This time I gave in to her pressure to see the television once more. Trees. Just dirt and trees. And then I realized. It was too familiar. The acorns, pine cones, trees, and grass. The woods behind the home was the location. My eyes flew to the tree line outside the window. The forest was warped by the intense rain. What had seemed like a wonderland to me was now a mystery. Then Grandma said, "However, not from the screen. the corridor, or the front door. My hand stung from Tomas's strong hold. Isabel started crying. "I'm heading to your grandfather's workplace to drop off some stuff." My heart fell. The camera was positioned to look into the backyard from the woods. The deck, where my grandmother spoke to us, was the main emphasis. Then it panned down to reveal me. When I saw the back of my head on the TV in front of me, my heart started to accelerate. Isabel stared directly into the camera as Thomas stood beside me. She appeared perplexed, as though she was unaware of what she was witnessing. Thomas and I started playing tag on screen, and I saw the point in my life where I was most close to passing away. I sprinted past the cameraman as I was fleeing Thomas, and he shifted the camera to follow me. The screen was not as loud as my heart. I nearly lost my breath due to the tightness in my throat. The cameraman then started to move, in the direction of the home, not us. He entered the family room directly and started filming. He laughed as he recorded the VHS cassettes strewn all over the floor. The man quickly fled into the closet to hide when my grandma returned home, forgetting something. "Thomas?" I said in a whisper. He realized the same thing as he glanced at me. It had a dark screen. When we first inserted the tape, we saw the same blank screen. However, it's worse than that. He hid in the same closet that I had spent so much of today standing next to. I always stood up to fast forward or rewind. I was just a few feet away. Now Thomas and I turned to the closet. We also noticed the door open, and a torn gray yarn and a wooden nose in the dark. My only memory is of Isabel and Thomas beside me, as I screamed and ran as fast as I could. We rushed into the attic after climbing to the second floor. We hoped the man wouldn't discover us as we hid in a hole. We heard footsteps after what seemed like hours. The old wooden steps creaked with movement. I cried with my eyes closed. We all shrieked when the crawlspace door opened. My grandmother questioned, "What has gotten into you three?" The entire globe then returned. As we explained it to her, we stammered. She took our testimony seriously, though I doubt she understood. Grandma took one of her husband's weapons out of the gun safe. "Remain here, and I'll see you later." "Excuse me," she said. "I will see you later. We'll have our daughter do stuff for us." She didn't take long at all. She got us and had us retell our story on the family room couch when she was certain that no one else was home. Although the cops were powerless, I believe she believed us. The closet was open, but there was no sign of the man in the woods, no dark red VHS tape in the player, and no man wearing a wooden mask. Ghost stories, or urban legends in general, have always captivated me. Black-eyed kids, vampires, ghostly dolls, the white lady, and like. I am aware that people my age no longer enjoy that type of horror, and instead favor the back rooms, analog horror, and all the new scary media. To be honest, I understand that things do need to change, and it makes sense that a classic ghost story would no longer be effective in light of all that is going on in the world. Nevertheless, I always enjoy old-fashioned horror. It's not so old, but things move quickly online. As a child, I watched YouTubers explore haunted places, go ghost hunting, and use all of their equipment, including voice recorders, special flashlights, EMF meters, a small radio device that they use to listen to radio frequencies and detect any interference, an antenna that beeps when something approaches, and more. I can honestly say that all of this was entertaining to me. I have therefore dreamed of doing these things myself for roughly 7 years. Naturally, I experimented with everything a young boy could do, such as Ouija, or foolishly moving around my house while shooting on my phone in the hopes that some random deceased person with unresolved business would show up to, I don't know, talk. In order to make friends in high school, I had to socially tone down my interest in those topics. I wish I could say that other people's opinions don't affect me, but it would be a lie. My enduring fascination with ghosts and spooky tales was unknown to my friends and classmates. I understand that it's a little absurd to keep this a secret, especially as my 18th birthday draws near. But it would be even stranger to tell after nearly 6 years of keeping it a secret, as if it were extremely prohibited. I began concealing my passion at the age of 12 in order to prevent others from criticizing it, and I continued to do so at the age of 17 in order to prevent others from criticizing the fact that I concealed it. I have to confess, it was a little pitiful. In any case, it all began a few days ago. The teacher in my art history class at school, assigning us large research projects. He had a fresh idea this time. The class will be split up into groups of 2, and each group will be given a building from our city that the teacher selected based on his interests in architecture and art. We will then have to visit the building, write an analysis of the various things we notice, and connect it to what we saw in class. He had requested permission from each property owner because none of the buildings were open to the public. This could have been worse, to be honest. In fact, it sounded like a very cool thing to do. Who would be my partner was now my main concern. I obviously hoped it would be one of my buddies. He began by announcing the groups after outlining the guidelines and precise directions for the task. All of my pals were gradually beginning to get assigned to their groups, so I was anxiously waiting to hear my name. Joshua? Yes, that's my name, the instructor said. You'll be with... I was gripping my chair. Elizabeth. Elizabeth and I exchanged glances as I turned to face her. Neither of us appeared enthusiastic. I didn't know precisely how to feel about it, but I didn't think it was a bad pair. Despite the fact that I was not an outcast or anything, Elizabeth was still far more popular than I was, even though we had been in the same class since my freshman year of high school. I didn't know much more about her, but it seemed like she would make a good companion. After that, the instructor handed us our building. I'll refer to what he provided us as Giraldi Street 22, as I won't tell you its true name. It turned out to be a quite old house with considerable historic significance. The instructor provided us with some background information so that we wouldn't be caught off guard. An elderly woman who had always resided there was the owner. She was willing to answer any queries we could have and seemed delighted to welcome young pupils. He cautioned us that we would need to speak loudly because her audition was weak. The instructor then suggested that we conduct some research beforehand so that we would have a general notion of where we were heading. Then I was standing in front of Elizabeth. There isn't much context, since I believe the last time we spoke was months ago when she was giving the class an exam, and I responded, "Thank you." I don't know why it took me so long to notice, but I suppose I never gave her much thought. She was wearing some obviously worn-out dungarees and was dressed in a somewhat outdated fashion. We were on Thursday, and the teacher had planned for us to visit on Sunday. "Well, I suppose we can both conduct our own research and then meet tomorrow, perhaps during lunch, to align our positions. Is that beneficial to you?" She questioned me. "That's great, we can accomplish that." "All right, see you tomorrow," I said. She said, "See you." She got up and walked away for her break after that. I returned home after the remainder of the day. My mom wasn't home as usual. She's a single mother to me and my younger sister Rosa, so she frequently needs to work late. After finishing my dinner, I retired to my room. To begin my study, I turned on my computer. Even if phrases like, "so much historical meaning for the city," "a house filled with stories," were coming up, it was still easy to discover information. The local media talked about it a lot, but they didn't provide many facts. I had to travel to page 2 of Google's search results since it was so weak, or what I like to refer to as the abyss of the internet. I'm exaggerating a little, but you don't frequently have to go there. Then I noticed something. It was a paranormal experience forum, and one of the posts listed the address. I clicked on it right away and read it through. Although it wasn't the most exciting story I've ever read, this is the main idea of it. The owner apparently opened the house as a cottage in the summer, and the poster was recounting his experiences while there. He spoke of a unique and somewhat oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the entire house, as well as the constant sense of being watched. He also mentioned occasionally hearing voices. Though brief, they frequently brought up his name. At the conclusion of his testimony, he described how, on his last night, he saw a small, expressionless child standing in front of his bed. The child began to slowly climb into it and grasped his legs in an attempt to drag him out of it. Despite his unbelievable power, the poster claimed that he eventually managed to shove the child away, and the boy eventually ran out of the room, giggling. The owner, who didn't believe in the paranormal and claimed that nothing comparable had ever happened to her, told him it must have been his imagination when he brought it up the next morning. This wasn't much, and I may have been lying entirely, but I wouldn't be telling the truth if I claimed it didn't pique my interest. Even though the story was as simple as it could be, it was extremely particular. To take occur in that location, which was not well known, and even less so for any paranormal activity. I kept that in mind while I carried on with my investigation, but I found very little more. So I went to bed. I was thinking when I lay in bed, what if the individual who shared his experience was honest? I had never been inside a place so old and steeped in history before, so this would have been the ideal location for my first ghost search. Naturally, though, I was going to school and wouldn't be alone, and it's also not very considerate of the owner, who graciously let us into her family's home. It wasn't really a choice because, even if I wanted to, I would be with Elizabeth all the time. I decided to put this off until later, as I glanced at the EMF meter I got for a birthday on my shelf. As scheduled, Elizabeth and I met at lunch the following day. We began discussing the findings of our investigation, and for obvious reasons, I omitted the forum post. After some discussion, we reached a definitive conclusion. Yeah, the problem is that we have the same exact information, and the only interesting information available online is very superficial information, I said. She said, "It's so interesting to see that they think a human being is worth millions of dollars." Yeah, I agree that we should prepare our questions for the owner instead, I replied. Do you suppose you can have yours on Sunday, you're right? Yes, no issue. After a little more conversation, we returned to class. I had some prepared questions for the owner on Saturday. Then Sunday arrived. The scheduled time for the meeting was 11 a.m. I got dressed, ate breakfast, and woke up as usual. I gave my room a final glance before I left, and I noticed my EMF meter. He seemed to be pleading with me to accept him. I took it and walked away. I had it, even though I wasn't sure if I would utilize it. I put it in my pocket after turning on the feature that allowed it to vibrate in place of igniting the little lamps. Elizabeth was waiting for me when I got to the house. When we knocked, we heard the owner respond, "Yes, yes, just a second," as he walked towards the door. When she opened, she appeared to be the cutest thing imaginable. Her face was inherently compassionate, and she was short. She was obviously wearing clothing and makeup appropriate for the situation. She cheerfully let us in and greeted us. The corridor was really lovely, and I could see why our teacher had chosen this property for us. It was really fascinating. Old photographs and paintings, primarily portraits, filled the walls. The folks on each of these looked quite serious, but that's common for ancient photos. After walking to the living room, we sat down together and she brought us tea. "So, I believe you have a few inquiries for me?" she inquired. She was obviously quite happy to speak. "Don't be shy. I'm not closed off." Elizabeth began asking her first question, which I followed, and we were able to ask her anything we wanted. Although it hadn't always been theirs, the house had been her family's for many centuries. All of the people in the hallway, whether they are depicted in paintings or photos, were once residents of the home and date back to the 15th century, so yes, it was rather old. She claimed that many of the people were unidentified and that they could only identify a small portion of the earliest generations. She was surprisingly fascinating to listen to, and she answered many more questions about the building's artistic and architectural history. Her warmth and excitement were infectious, and we both felt compelled to ask more questions. When we finally reached the end of our list, it was time to visit, make notes, conduct analysis, and so forth. She let us to go about the house freely, but asked us not to touch anything because many items were valuable. "When we're done, she'll be baking cookies," she remarked. Elizabeth and I drank our tea and discovered that we were alone in the living room. "God, she is quite cute." Elizabeth smiled as she spoke. "Yes, She is really sweet. I didn't anticipate that. I said, perhaps we should begin there. Pointing to the room next to us, she said. We stood up and went inside. Massive bookcases covered the walls. I began examining the books while Elizabeth began taking notes while she observed the room. Probably over 1,000 books were there, some of which appeared to be very old. The least I could say after reading the titles of a few of them was that they needed to be reorganized. It was a little haphazard, with cooking Asian food, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, an old book with the title removed, and even a CD in the center. Eventually, we made our way to the corridor. With all many eyes that seemed to be watching us, it was a little oppressive. We resumed taking notes after Elizabeth mentioned that it felt a little strange. One mural in the rear of the hall caught my attention at one time. For someone who would have lived there, the young woman was dressed in a classical manner, but perhaps a little shoddily. If I'm being honest, she was very attractive. However, the fact that it was the only one grinning attracted my attention. She grinned while everyone else she represented looked grave. A warm, kind, and even compassionate smile. She appeared to be staring at me, I noted. That sensation is of course shared by many artworks, but it was more powerful for her. A beat skipped in my chest. I was certain that she had just given me a wink. I gasped. I thought she gave me a wink. The atmosphere changed from a little stifling to really weighty. Then it reached both of us. Elizabeth. Just now a voice that was unfamiliar muttered. Elizabeth looked across at me. Did you say that? She inquired. Elizabeth. This time, a younger voice. The owner was in the kitchen, and since we were facing each other, we realized it couldn't be one of us this time. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she approached me slowly. Elizabeth, she leapt. What the fuck? I exclaimed. We were examining our surroundings. I don't like this, Joshua. Yes, neither am I. Every painting looked perfect to us. And we were still. It was a deep voice that came from behind us at the time. What the fuck is that? What is it? Holy shit, holy shit. I was breathing more rapidly and Elizabeth was murmuring in panic. Everyone began reciting her name in unison. Elizabeth, Elizabeth, Elizabeth. When I looked at the artwork of the young woman from earlier, she was the only one who remained motionless. She had the same grin and appeared at peace. We were both freaking out, but I can't recall exactly what I was whispering at the time. A scratching sound reached our ears. The paintings and photographs were being punctured by long, filthy, sharp-nailed hands that were almost horrible. As they continued to recite her name, the people's eyes turned completely black and their jaws opened wider than was humanly possible. All the hands were moving toward us, and suddenly those hands were all around us, caressing each other. They then proceeded much more quickly, and many of them penetrated Elizabeth's skin with their claws as they descended all over her body. She let out a loud cry of agony. It was a scream of terror. As they closed the piercings, all of the hands reached their photos and returned inside. The paintings and photographs soon returned to normal, but Elizabeth was on the floor, sobbing and covered in blood. I lowered myself to her level and did my best to reassure her, but I was too shocked and scared to be of much use. We heard the proprietor approach us. How are the two of you doing? Is everyone okay? I heard screams. She walked into the hall and observed what was happening. She appeared utterly stunned. However, what took place? She inquired. We both gazed at her with whatever faces we were making at the time because we couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't make her think we were insane. Without much delay, she proceeded to administer first aid to a child. While I was thinking about what had happened, she sat down and covered Elizabeth with bandages. We both wanted to go when she was finished, so we said we had what we needed for the time being. She packed some biscuits for each of us while looking pitying. She uttered one final word as we opened the door to depart. I'm hoping you'll return. She had a dejected expression and tone. We exited and found ourselves on the street. We both exchanged glances. She appeared to have been in a major altercation since she was covered in bands. I opened my mouth to say something, but she raised her hand. "Not today. One more," I said. She said, "See you at the school." She then departed. I left as well, taking one final glance at the mansion. I couldn't make out the old owner's countenance as she watched me from her window. I disregarded it and returned home because I was too exhausted. Now that I'm home, I'm posting this. Elizabeth added me on Instagram, but I don't have any updates on her, so if anyone has any theories, I'll take them because I'm at a loss for what to do at this point, and I have a lot of questions. Of course, I welcome inquiries as well. You must wake up. I'm not sure how you'll take this message. My television screen was filled with such words. I had just been watching an old Western while my wife slept soundly in my lap. Since it had been just past 10 when I last checked, it was just past midnight, which meant I must have fallen asleep at some point, and going to work in the morning would be yet another demanding experience. However, I was immediately brought back to reality by the words that had taken the place of the film. "You live in a false universe. Jack, get up." I suddenly forgot everything around me as I sat motionless in my cozy recliner. The name felt familiar, despite its generic nature, but it wasn't mine. My wife groaned a little, as she often did when she was dreaming or talking in her sleep. I wondered if I was dreaming or if I had truly gone asleep. Letting someone else verify what I was truly saying was the only way to be certain. I gave her a gentle shake and whispered, "Mary, honey, please, wake up." She appeared so at ease, as like she was safe with me and all the evils in the world didn't matter. I paused to simply appreciate her, and when I looked up again, the strange message had been replaced by the Western movie's roll credits. The alarming warning appeared more than an hour ago, while the clock indicated 1:34 a.m. Although it seemed like only a few seconds had gone by, time had flown by. Then I recalled that when you glance at the time when you're dreaming, strange things happen. There must have been nothing more than a nightmare. However, I was unable to force myself to awaken. I told myself that I lived somewhere on the edge of reality, with one foot in the world of sleep, and that the message had been the result of my sleep-deprived mind. I simply picked up a blanket and snuggled my wife in after losing the battle and not feeling prepared to get up for work in the morning. I was debating whether or not to simply take her to bed because I didn't want to wake her, and it wouldn't be too difficult given my stature. I was headed toward our bedroom halfway up the stairs before I realized it. I checked my watch and saw that it was 2:04 a.m. Another half hour had just passed. I was struck with the realization. I had no prior history of absent seizures, and I had never sleepwalked. The picture on the wall caught my attention next. Even though it had always existed, I had never stopped to simply notice it. Though it seemed so far away, as though it only half existed when no one was looking, I knew in all honesty that my wife had hung it up there when we moved in together. It showed a gathering of individuals in odd black costumes standing outside of an old structure. Although I couldn't tell for sure in the dark if it was a painting or a real photograph, my instinct was to think it was the former. They were holding hands, but none of them were grinning, and many of them lacked hands, legs, or even half of their heads. A fragment of handwritten text was located at the bottom. It said, "Trial and Error, the First Test. 2013. It was such a strange year. The clothes and the structure appeared to be considerably older. My body began to tremble with horror just by looking at it. My arms started to get goosebumps, and I realized it was time for some much-needed sleep. As soon as I made that choice, everything around me became dark. After a few seconds, or perhaps minutes, I woke up in my bed with my wife sleeping next to me. Warm beams of sunlight were penetrating our beige curtains as the sun had just risen above the horizon. Already the events of the previous evening were beginning to fade. There was no other reasonable explanation, so it had to be a dream. "Are you all right?" Mary saw me looking out into the world and asked in a drowsy, exhausted voice. I couldn't remember getting up or getting dressed, but I was standing in front of the window, with the same shirt and pants I typically wore to work. You appear worn out. Were you unable to sleep? I stammered, I don't know. I dreamed some strange dreams. The strangeness of the light outdoors was striking. It was flawless in every way, devoid of any glaring flaws. With the exception of a few pristine white clouds, it shone brilliantly through the clear blue sky. Trees danced softly in the wind as a magnificent orange gradient filled the horizon. Gary, that's the third time this week. That was my name. Gary. But it sounded so alien. I had known that since I was able to speak in complete sentences as a young child, but for some reason it didn't work for me. Mary said, "Perhaps you ought to make another appointment with Dr. June." Only because I had known him for years did I consent. Although I couldn't imagine how he could meaningfully analyze my dreams, he had helped me go through some pain. Fortunately, he had a free appointment that morning when I called him after breakfast. I informed my employer that I would be late because of an appointment. They were more than willing to make accommodations for me, as usual. Dr. June greeted me into his office with his customary enthusiasm, saying, "Gary, it's great to see you on this fine morning." He had always referred to me by my first name, saying it helped individuals feel more at ease and open up. The man knew almost everything about me, so I was unable to refute his assertion. When I informed him about my dreams, he listened calmly and made some notes in his book. "Gary, could you please explain the meaning of these dreams to me?" I never saw the question coming, even though it was so obvious. I hadn't given it much attention because I was more worried about getting rid of them than I was about comprehending them. However, I've been having trouble lately determining if these were actually dreams or just a warped perception of reality. I finally said, "It feels like my life isn't real. I occasionally get flashes and see images of strangers. They all look so familiar, though. I don't get it." Before he sighed and turned to face me, he asked a few more questions. "Eerie, we have spent the most of this year discussing your dreams, and they aren't improving. I would prefer to start you on some sort of medicine, but I'm not quite ready to make a specific diagnosis." "Substances? What sort?" I inquired. He let out another sigh. "That's the problem, Gary. You might object if I explain how it operates. This drug is new, and I've seen positive outcomes with other patients who have similar life-altering symptoms. For just a few weeks, I would like to put you on it." "Great. We'll discuss again if it works. If not, we'll just stop the treatment if you experience any negative side effects. I need to know if you're on board because I'm not supposed to do it this way." I had a suspicious expression on my face as I gazed at him. He had never questioned or disapproved of my stories, and he had always been kind to me. I chose to try the treatment even though I'm not one to trust unknown medications, because I trusted him more than most. "All right, Doc, I guess you know best." He gave me an unlabeled pill container with the straightforward directions to take one before bed every day. I had been suffering from an unidentified illness for months, and that was all it would take to be better. So, when the training was over, I walked to work. I needed the fresh air to help me think, and my car was safely kept in a nearby garage. The same strange flashes of people, places, and times that seemed familiar but too far away appeared before my eyes as my thoughts strayed to the darkest recesses of my mind. They were there even though they couldn't possibly be mine. The faint sounds of someone crying were the only thing that brought me back to reality. In the distance, a girl was crying. It took me some time to determine their precise origins, but her voice reverberated strangely across the crowded streets. Despite the dozens of people passing by, I noticed her standing in an alleyway across the street. For a moment, I was hesitant because I thought it could seem strange for a big guy to approach an unfamiliar youngster. But I reasoned that I could at least contact the police or assist her find her parents. "Hey, how are you?" she calmly responded. I nodded calmly. She then went back to her journaling. She was no more than 8 years old. She had brilliant blonde hair and was dressed in a school uniform. "Where are your parents?" I inquired. Her expression was one of slight shock as she gazed at me. "They're not present. I want to go home," she was saying. This made me all but satiate with desire for her and her presence. Where do you reside? She surveyed her surroundings. I'm not sure. This place bothers me. This isn't true. I want to go home, she said again. Excuse me, she said again. You mean that this isn't real? There is nothing real. My parents have left. My parents are not the new ones. They are not the genuine ones. Nobody is real. Even though she was growing angrier with every question, I found what she stated to be unsettling. I heard sirens approaching from behind me before I could ask any more inquiries. 2 police officers came out of a police car that was parked on the side of the road. Joanna? Inquired one of them. The little girl gave me a look. Don't let them take me, she screamed, her voice full with terror. Don't worry, Joanna, the policeman said. We're going to bring your parents back. She protested by screaming, No, as he came closer. You're not authentic. Leap. I glanced back and forth between the little girl and the policeman, who appeared to be just as perplexed as I was. I attempted to interrupt by saying, Hey, wait a minute. The girl is ill, sir. Before I could protest, they countered. She needs help. However, just stay put, okay? We'll handle it from here. There was only one way out of the alleyway, and the officers were blocking it when she turned to run. My immediate impulse was to assist, but I didn't want to risk getting arrested, or worse. They appeared sincere in wanting to assist her, and I could rationally see why. However, I didn't feel comfortable with the circumstances, even if their actions made perfect sense. She begged out once again, Please, don't let them take me away. Before I could fully comprehend what had happened, she was hauled away. I made a mental pledge to phone and see how she was doing, but as soon as she was out of sight, it seemed like my brain was having trouble remembering what had transpired only seconds earlier. In any event, I had to go since work called. My employment consisted mostly of tedious paperwork, so it wouldn't be a very productive day. As long as I made myself appear busy, no one would ever know whether I was truly working. I took out the pill bottle to examine it once I was at my desk. Neither a label nor instructions were included with the package. It was merely a bottle containing 30 tiny, hazy white pills. I tried to figure out how something so insignificant might alter my life by rolling one of them between my fingers. My computer screen sprang to life while I was holding the small pill. It was merely a black picture with some words in the center. Jack, don't do it. After a few moments, things returned to normal. Nothing more, nothing less, just that straightforward message. It was unclear to me whether they were referring to the tablets or anything else. In any event, I was unable to remain at work. When I told my boss I was feeling ill, he allowed me to leave early since he was the wonderful man he always was. I simply passed out on the couch in front of the television when I got there. I didn't mind that Mary was working overtime to finish a project, so she wouldn't be home for several hours. In search of some sustenance, I headed to the refrigerator. My wife had prepared a platter of my favorite dinner there. I am aware of how much pressure you are under. I simply want you to know that you can always count on me. This should help you feel a little better. I adore you, Mary. For the first time in more than a week, I smiled. Briefly. The best thing that had ever occurred to me was, in fact, her. If nothing else, I had to get well again for her. As I ate the food in front of the TV, a small amount of joy grew inside of me. Every bite was as delicious as the last. The time for the first tablet was approaching, and the bottle of pills was on the side table next to me. I grabbed it up and held it in my palms while continuing to watch the movie. I then had a sick feeling in my stomach when I twisted the lid off. Then the television screen went black, showing only a single sentence. Jack, don't take the pill. That was the final straw that pushed me over the brink. I was unsure if I had gone insane, but I didn't care. I yelled at the TV, What the fuck do you want from me? All I got back was, Look at the painting. I wasn't sure what they meant at first. On its own, the message was completely ridiculous. But then I remembered how enthralling the artwork on the stairs had been the day before, how I had spent over an hour motionless in front of it. I set down the pill container as the black screen returned to the movie. Halfway up the stairs, I approached the strange image that was hanging on the wall. The house was filled with weird shadows from the sun's recent descent. It made the image so blurry that I was still unable to identify if it was a realistic painting or a snapshot. As time went on, the outside began to grow darker. I didn't know what I was searching for, but I just kept staring. Gary, my wife discovered me standing on the steps and screamed out, "What the hell are you doing? I've spent hours attempting to phone you. Why didn't you answer?" The evening had given way to the early hours of the night. Mary had been working extra hours in an attempt to contact someone, and it was now beyond 11 o'clock. Hours had passed while I stood there, gazing at the photo. I said, "Where did you get the picture?" Mary gazed at me in disbelief before focusing on the wall mount photo. Her face took on a bewildered look, and she came over to check it out. I'm not really sure. I had never seen the image before. It was just a little bit there. Her remark validated every strange aspect of the image. I extended my hands to take it off, but Mary caught my arms before I could do so, preventing me from doing so. I said, "Why are you stopping me?" "I'm not sure. Simply put, I'm afraid." I experienced the same hesitancy and concern about what might be hidden beneath it. Nevertheless, I reached for it and removed it from the wall. When it was gone, there was nothing at all visible. "What is that?" Mary asked, startled. Since what was behind the painting was essentially nothing, a hole in reality that had been long before our stay in that house, I had no idea how to respond to the inquiry. Nothing, just darkness, complete darkness. I grabbed my phone, switched on the flashlight, and pointed it into the dark, but it didn't light anything up. What a waste. I thought the phone's light was just not strong enough, so I hurried back upstairs and fumbled in the kitchen drawers and cupboards until I located the large 4-cell mag light I had seen as a kid. A flashlight, long and heavy, with a strong beam. After testing the batteries by turning it on, I hurried back into the basement. I was confused as I shone the light inside the entryway. Beyond the threshold, nothing could be seen in the dark area by the flashlight beam. It didn't reveal anything that might have been in the secret room, nor did it shine a spotlight circle of brilliance on the back wall. The light beam seems oddly diffused. The beam appeared to be absorbed by the unbounded blackness rather than pierce it. The experience was similar to shining a flashlight at the night sky, as though the light shaft had nothing substantial to fix on. I was unable to understand it. I couldn't see what I was seeing. As I stood there, thinking about that Stygian gulf, I felt as though I was gazing upon a huge, dark room of unknowable size. A room that appeared to irrationally defy the actual size of my mother's home. I had a sudden wave of existential anguish and despair that nearly drove me insane. I had the impression that I was seeing through a gateway into the godless black emptiness of non-existence that must exist beyond the universe's ultimate reaches, a realm where nothing existed, had been, or would exist. Robert. It seemed like peering into the depths of hell. I didn't even notice the voice for a few seconds, supposing I had only dreamed it. Then it called my name once more. Robert. My mother's voice was heard. Even though I hadn't heard it in almost 2 decades, I could still easily identify it. The voice of my deceased mother. From the dark abyss outside the threshold, whispering my name. I experienced a sudden, primitive fear that was so strong that it was nearly impossible for me to think clearly. I started to shake. I was out of breath. Once more, the voice was faint, as though it were coming from a great distance, yet it was obviously that of my late mother. Additionally, it was clear that it was an urgent plea. "Please, Robert, help me." Something inside of me said, "This isn't real," in an attempt to keep my sanity and make sense of what was going on. "It isn't possible. You're having a dream." "Please, Robert, help me," the voice that had been reincarnated pleaded frantically. "Aid me. This place is really chilly and dim, and I have scars from my scratches on my body." The voice was attempting to entice me into the unknown darkness through the doorway. And I realized with a sudden, icy certainty that it wasn't my mother trying to entice me to it. Please, Robert. I became paralyzed. Abruptly, obsessively, I rushed for the door and slammed it shut, keeping out that terrible, strange blackness. The voice went silent instantly. With a sharp spike in adrenaline, I closed the hasp while gasping. I glanced about the basement. Even though the padlock was broken, I managed to secure the door by finding a screwdriver among the old tools and inserting it into the hasp. After that, I hurried upstairs, stopping only to pick up the envelope my mother had sent me, which had not yet been opened. I jumped out of the house, got into my car, and sped off. I haven't been back since. An hour or so later, I was nearly normal when I came home. Up until I was just a few miles from my place, I drove my car on autopilot and was largely unaware of my surroundings, spending the majority of the return trip in a state of shock. Then, I had a debilitating panic attack and had to drive into a gas station. I managed to avoid throwing up in my car by opening my door and sticking my head out. For 10 minutes, I just fell back and covered my face with my hands while gasping and crying until I was able to regain some semblance of control. I went inside, closed the door, and sat down on my couch to look at the manila envelope I had discovered on the secret basement door. For heaven's sake, Robert, don't ever open this door. I took it open. A stack of musty-smelling handwritten pages was inside. As I read, I started to see why my mother had concealed that door from me for so long, and why she had left me a warning for the day I would unavoidably find out. The year I was born was written on the first page. Almost 40 years ago, when I was still a baby, my mother had written this and left it for me. When I was a kid, Mom may have been afraid that anything would happen to her or that she wouldn't be around to warn me if I happened to stumble across the door. The same chilly dread that had crept into my body when I had initially opened the door returned as I read. The year after her parents' Irish immigration to the United States, my mother was born. After years of saving money from their hard-working menial occupations as factory workers, they had purchased the old house when she was 5 years old. They were thankful to have a real home of their own, a place to raise their family, rather than the small slum flat they had all been sharing. The house had been dilapidated even then, but it had been inexpensive and all they could afford. In the residence, 3 years went by without incident. When my mother was 8 years old, the horror started. She and her brother, who was 10 years old, were the youngest of 5 children. The other 3 had already grown up and joined their parents' jobs. Because of this, they were frequently left alone in the house until the rest of the family arrived home in the evening, when they weren't in school. This may seem like child neglect to you, but keep in mind that things were different in the early 1960s. The basement door was discovered by her brother. It had been hidden at the time beneath a set of shelves that held old preserve jars that the previous owner had left behind. It was their autumn break from school, and it was a windy, cold day in late autumn. He found it when he crammed himself into the small gap between the shelves and the wall while they were playing hide-and-seek. He had shared what he had discovered with their parents and older siblings when they returned home. Their father and her 2 elder brothers had taken down the bookcases to reveal the entrance, and they were intrigued. It appeared to have been closed for at least a century and had been secured with an old brass padlock, one of those circular railroad locks you see in vintage Western movies. When her father tugged at the padlock, it shattered to dust since it was so ancient and rusty. Their father had closed the door after opening it, shining a flashlight and taking one quick glance inside. According to my mother's writing, she had never seen her father appear so terrified as he did at that moment, either before or after. He'd ordered his 5 kids to stay away from that door and never open it again. He had sent them all to bed and refused to answer any inquiries. My mother had heard her parents arguing frantically in their bedroom that evening. She had listened with her ear to the wall. She heard her father talking to her mother about his sister laughing in the dark and buying a new lock at the hardware store tomorrow. But she couldn't make out what they were saying. It didn't sound like they were fighting, she added, but their voices were passionate and low. They sounded as though they were simply afraid. What her father had stated about hearing his sister giggle disturbed my mother. My mother's aunt was her father's only sister, but she passed away while he was still a young boy in Ireland. Her brother had been fascinated, but my mother had been terrified. He had been curious about what his father may have heard or seen beyond that door that would have caused him such distress. Any fear he might have had was overshadowed by his curiosity. He had defied his father's command later that evening, after the rest of the family had gone to sleep. He had risen, descended to the basement, and pushed open the door. When my mother woke up the following morning, she heard my grandma frantically yelling her husband's name. The basement had been the source of her voice. They had rushed to the basement with the family. In the corner, my uncle was hunched, trembling violently, and my mother had seen her mother hovering over him. According to my mother's writing, she was haunted by what she saw for the rest of her life and never forgot it. With his teeth bared like a snarling dog's and his eyes bulging from their sockets, her brother's face was twisted in a grimace of sheer, unfathomable horror. He was fully white-haired. The secret basement door, which stood wide open on a rectangle of complete blackness, was directly in front of his bulging, unblinking eyes. Although he was still alive, he was completely catatoniad, meaning he was unable to move, speak, or respond to any stimuli. My uncle was taken to the hospital after my grandparents called for an ambulance. My father sealed the cellar door and bought a new padlock right away. My uncle was sent to a mental health facility. Although it took more than a year for him to become functional enough to go back home, he amazingly recovered against all expectations, even though the experts said he would never do so. After that, he was never quite the same. He was silent, reclusive, and depressed. He was also prone to panic attacks and emotional outbursts. He had a hard time falling asleep, and when he did, he frequently had night terrors and dreams. He would scream in fits of terror if pressed about what had occurred to him that night, and would never, ever enter the basement or even approach the kitchen door that led to it. If someone attempted to force him, he would turn violent. Over the course of the following year, his health steadily declined. Due to sleep deprivation, he lost weight and developed black circles around his eyes. He started to jump at every sound out of paranoia. If they could have, my grandparents would have taken him to see a psychiatrist, but they just did not have the funds.